Most people don't notice it happening. And that, in itself, is part of what makes it so disorienting when it finally comes into focus. It doesn't arrive with a diagnosis or an event. There's no morning where you wake up and think, today is the day everything changes. Instead, it accumulates dots slowly, almost invisibly, the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water. You are going about your life, doing what you've always done, moving through the rhythms that have defined your days, and then, at some point, something feels off. Not wrong, exactly. Not broken. But different dot, as if someone has turned a dial somewhere in the quiet interior of your life. And the frequency has shifted, and now the world you're standing in is the same world it always was. But you are receiving it differently. This is not a midlife crisis. It is not depression. It is not burnout, though it can sometimes look like all three. What it is a threshold, one that most people reach somewhere in their mid-30s, and that almost no one talks about honestly, because we don't really have the language for it. We know how to talk about growing up. We know how to talk about getting old, but we haven't done nearly as good a job of talking about the long, complicated, deeply meaningful territory in between. The years when you are neither young nor old, when the assumptions you built your life on start to feel less certain, and when the questions you never had time to ask begin to surface, quietly, persistently, in the spaces between everything else. That is what this is about. Underscore somewhere around the mid-30s. And sometimes a little later into the early 40s, something begins to change in the way life feels from the inside. Not the life itself, necessarily. From the outside, everything may look entirely intact. The career is progressing. The relationships are in place. The routines are functioning. But beneath the surface of all that function, there is a subtle shift in texture. A change in how everything registers dot. It can begin with something as simple as noticing that weekends go by faster than they used to. That a month can pass and leave almost no trace in memory. That the year feels shorter than it did a decade ago, and shorter still than the decade before that. You find yourself doing the arithmetic more often. 10 years ago, I was doing this. 15 years ago, I was there, and the math keeps coming out strange. Because those years don't feel like the vast stretches of time. They actually were. They feel close, compressed, as if the past is not receding at the proper rate. This is one of the first signals. And it unsettles people. Not just because it suggests time is moving fast, but because it raises the question of what, exactly, is being done with it. Other signals come in different forms. You may begin to notice that certain ambitions, the ones you carried for years, the ones that once felt like the engine of your forward motion, have lost some of their charge. Not all ambition disappears, but the specific kind that was fueled by external validation, by the need to prove something, by the desire to be seen as successful or capable or worthy of admiration, that kind begins to quiet down. And in the space it leaves, there is often a strange combination of relief and unease. Relief, because the pressure lifts. Unease, because you're not entirely sure what was underneath it. Friendships change too. This is one of the more difficult aspects of this transition, because friendship is something most people prefer not to examine too closely. We like to believe that the people who matter to us now are the people who will always matter to us. But after 35, many people find that their social world is quietly reorganizing itself. Some relationships that once felt essential have become more occasional, not through conflict or betrayal, but simply because the two people involved have moved in different directions and no longer have much to say to each other when they sit down. Other connections, newer ones or older ones that were always slightly undervalued, have deepened. There is a growing preference in many people at this stage for fewer relationships that are more honest, more substantive, more real. And then there is solitude. The way it begins to feel different. not like something to be avoided or filled, but like something to be sought, something with its own quality and texture and value. Many people in their 30s and 40s find themselves, for the first time, genuinely comfortable being alone, not because they are withdrawing from the world, but because solitude has become the space where they can most clearly hear themselves think, where the noise of expectation and performance and comparison falls away, and what remains is something quieter and more honest. Underscore, why does this happen? What is actually taking place beneath the surface of these experiences that produces this shift? Part of the answer lies in the basic architecture of how human identity develops. We tend to think of identity as something that is formed in adolescence, and then, more or less, held in place. You figure out who you are, and then you go live as that person. But the psychological reality is more complicated and more interesting than that. Identity is not a fixed thing. It is a living process. And the process of becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who you are shaped to become, continues well into adulthood, and arguably deepens in precisely this period we're describing. Erik Erikson, whose work on human development remains among the most insightful frameworks we have for understanding adult life, described the central challenge of middle adulthood as the tension between what he called generativity and stagnation. Generativity for Erikson was the impulse toward contribution, the desire to invest in something beyond yourself, to create something lasting, to care for others, to feel that your presence in the world is leaving some kind of mark. Stagnation was its absence, the experience of feeling stuck in the perpetual management of your own concerns, without a sense of outward purpose or meaning. What Erikson observed was that this tension doesn't typically emerge in full until a person has lived long enough to feel it. You have to have built something before you can begin to question what you built it for. You have to have pursued something before you can wonder whether that pursuit was truly yours, or whether it was inherited from someone else's idea of a good life. This is precisely what begins to happen in the mid-30s. The scaffolding of early adulthood, the career ambitions, the social expectations, the life milestones that seemed so urgent, has, by this point, largely been erected. And now, standing inside the structure you have built, you begin to see its contours more clearly. You begin to notice which rooms feel like yours, and which ones you are only living in because you thought you were supposed to. Carl Jung wrote about this dynamic with considerable insight, and his observations have aged remarkably well. He believed that the first half of life is necessarily oriented outward, toward building a self that can function in the world, earn its place, establish its presence. The ego is constructed through this outward orientation. It is essential work, but Jung also believed that somewhere in the middle of life, the psyche begins to call for a different kind of movement, not outward, but inward, not toward more achievement, but toward more authenticity, not toward the expansion of the constructed self, but toward contact with something deeper, what he sometimes called the self with a capital S, the fuller, more complex, less socially conditioned version of who you actually are. Jung's term for the work of this second half of life was individuation, and it is not an easy process. It involves, among other things, encountering the parts of yourself that you have ignored, suppressed, or simply never had occasion to develop. It involves releasing identities that no longer fit, even when those identities were ones you worked hard to build. It involves sitting with uncertainty and incompleteness in ways that earlier life rarely required. The acceleration of time, too, has a psychological explanation worth understanding. Research in cognitive psychology has consistently found that the perceived speed of time is closely related to the proportion of novel experience in a given period. When everything is new, when you are encountering unfamiliar situations, learning new skills, building relationships from the ground up, time feels rich and dense. Each day deposits a substantial amount of memory. The weeks feel long and distinct, but as life settles into established patterns, as familiarity replaces novelty, the density of memory thins out. Days that are similar to other days leave little trace. Weeks that follow familiar rhythms blur together. And the result is that time feels as if it is accelerating, not because it is moving faster, but because less of it is being retained in memory as distinct and meaningful experience. This is one reason why people at this stage of life often feel a sudden hunger for new experiences. Travel, new learning, creative projects, changes in routine. These things don't just provide distraction or entertainment, they restore depth to the experience of time. They slow it down by making it worth remembering. Viktor Frankl, writing from the experience of having survived the most extreme conditions imaginable, observed that the human being is not primarily a creature of pleasure or of power, but a creature of meaning. The will to meaning, as he called it, is among the most fundamental of human motivations. And what happens in midlife is that many people find themselves, for the first time with real urgency, confronting the question of whether the life they are living is meaningful to them, not in the abstract, but in the specific, daily, embodied sense of whether what they are doing with their time and energy actually matters to them, at the deepest level they can access. This is the question beneath all the other questions that arise at this threshold. Not just am I happy, but does this mean something? Not just is my life going well, but is it mine? Underscore, the emotional experience of standing at this threshold is complicated, and it deserves to be described honestly rather than smoothed over. Confusion is, for many people, the dominant feeling, because when the changes that are happening are interior, when the shift is in how you experience your own life, rather than in the external facts of it, there is no obvious cause to name, no problem to point to, no solution to search for. You simply find yourself feeling differently about everything. And that feeling of difference, without a clear explanation, can be deeply disorienting. There is also a particular kind of grief that belongs to this stage, a grief that doesn't quite match the usual templates, because there is no specific loss to mourn. What is being grieved, in many cases, is a version of yourself. The earlier self who moved through the world with a particular kind of energy and certainty. The self who believed that the future was full of open possibilities, and that the path ahead was still wide and uncharted. You don't want to be that self again, necessarily. You are often aware, looking back, of how anxious or uncertain or unformed that earlier version actually was. But there was something in that openness, that unfinished quality, that you miss without quite being able to say why. Nostalgia, in this period, takes on a different character than it has at other times. It is less about longing for specific experiences and more about longing for a particular relationship to time, the sense of having more of it, of being less aware of its limits, of feeling that tomorrow is guaranteed and distant and full of room. Standing on the other side of that innocence, even partially, changes how the past looks. And then there is the questioning, the re-examination of choices that were made in an earlier, different version of your life, not always with regret, sometimes simply with curiosity. Why did I choose this path? What was I believing when I made that decision? If I were starting from here, now, with what I know and value today, would I make the same choices? These questions are not destructive. In fact, they are among the most productive questions a person can ask. But they can feel threatening, especially if you have built a life around the assumption that the choices you made were the only right ones. The quiet threshold asks you to hold your past decisions with a lighter grip, to understand them as the best efforts of someone who is doing what they could with what they had at the time, and to allow yourself the freedom to think differently, now without that difference invalidating what came before. There is also loneliness in this transition, a particular variety of it, the loneliness of feeling that the experience you are having is not one that the people around you seem to be having, or at least not one they are talking about. The social world, in many cases, is still speaking the language of achievement and acquisition and forward momentum, still orienting around the questions of early adulthood. Where are you going? What are you building? What comes next? And when those questions begin to feel less relevant to your interior life, when you have started asking different questions, it can be isolating, as if you have shifted into a frequency that the people around you are not quite tuned to. This loneliness is worth naming because it is real, and because it is one of the most common unexpressed experiences of this stage of life. It is not a sign of something wrong with you. It is a sign that you are thinking about things that most people think about privately, if at all. And yet, within all of this, within the confusion and the grief and the acceleration and the questioning, there is something else available. Something that is harder to describe, but that many people, looking back at this period of their lives, come to regard as one of the most important things that ever happened to them. The quiet shift of the mid-30s and 40s is not a problem to be solved. It is not a crisis to be managed. It is an invitation, a doorway opening inward into a territory of the self that could not have been reached before this point. You have to have lived a certain amount of life to be standing where you are now. You have to have built and questioned and lost and learned. The confusion and the grief are not obstacles to this threshold. They are part of it. They are the texture of genuine development. What begins to become possible at this stage? What opens up, slowly, for people who are willing to stay with the difficulty rather than flee from it, is a deeper kind of authenticity. A way of living that is less driven by external expectation and more grounded in genuine personal value. Less focused on performing a life and more focused on actually experiencing one. This is not a small thing. Most of us spend the first decades of our adult lives in some degree of performance. Not dishonestly, not cynically, but simply because we were building ourselves in relation to the world, constructing identities that could function and be accepted and succeed by the measures that our families and cultures and peers provided. And that construction was necessary. It served its purpose. But it was never the whole story. The whole story begins to become accessible here. At this threshold, when the performance begins to feel heavy, and the questions begin to feel more important than the answers, and the silence begins to feel like something worth listening to. What does it mean to live with less to prove? What does it feel like to make a choice that is genuinely yours, not because it aligns with someone else's vision of success, but because it aligns with your own deepest sense of what matters? These are not questions with simple answers, but they are, I would argue, among the most important questions available to a human being. And they become available, really available, with full weight and seriousness, at precisely this stage of life. So if you are in this territory right now, if something in what I have described has resonated with your own experience, if you have been living with that quiet, unnamed feeling of difference and not quite known what to do with it, then I want to say something to you directly. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not failing some version of the life you are supposed to have. You are at a turning point, a real one, the kind that doesn't announce itself with clarity or drama, but that matters deeply in the long arc of a life. The fact that things feel different is not a symptom. It is a signal. And the signal is not warning you that something has gone wrong. It is telling you that something is becoming more honest, more real, more genuinely yours. What this moment asks of you is not action necessarily, not a plan, not a change, not a dramatic pivot. What it asks, first and most essentially, is attention, the willingness to slow down enough to feel what you are actually feeling, to hear what the quiet is saying, to take seriously the questions that have been surfacing, rather than burying them under the next task or the next distraction, or the next version of forward momentum. It asks you to be patient with yourself in a new way. Not the patience of waiting for things to get easier, but the patience of allowing something important to take the time it needs to emerge. Development at this stage of life is not fast. It doesn't follow a clear schedule, but it is real, and it is happening. And the people who come through it with the most clarity and depth are almost always the ones who stayed present with the difficulty rather than looking for a shortcut around it. And it invites you gently, without pressure, to begin considering what a life shaped more honestly by your own values might actually look like. Not in the abstract, not as a fantasy, but in the specific, daily, practical sense of how you spend your time, what you give your energy to, and what you allow yourself to care about. The life that is available on the other side of this threshold is not perfect. It is not free from struggle or uncertainty or loss, but it has a quality that is genuinely different from the life that came before it. It has less performance in it, and more presence. Less reaching for external validation, and more resting in internal knowing. Less living according to someone else's story, and more living according to your own. Underscore the light through. The window is the same light it has always been. The coffee is the same. The sounds of your world are familiar and continuous. But something in you is different. Something has been changing, quietly and persistently, for longer than you may have realized, and the fact that you can feel it now, that you are present enough, honest enough, open enough to notice, is not a problem. It is the beginning of something. The years between 35 and wherever you are going are not a slow decline from the vitality of youth. They are not a waiting room. They are not a long and gradual diminishment. They are the years when, if you are willing, the real depth of a life becomes accessible. When the questions that matter most stop feeling abstract and start feeling urgent in the best possible way. When the self you have been building all these years begins to give way to the self you are always becoming. You have not missed anything. You have not fallen behind. You are exactly where the arc of a genuine human life brings you, at the threshold, standing in that quiet, particular moment when everything you have lived and lost and learned is available to you, and the next chapter is not yet written. That is not a crisis. That is an invitation. And all it asks is that you walk through,